Well, it's November the 11th, 2021, and the topic today is the economy. With the announcement that inflation has hit 6.8% for the month of November, and that's created some headlines on this issue and a variety of concerns as the transitory inflation continues to be a little less than transitory. Um, so, and I'm going to try to address this in a little bit in view of the broader economic issues of the national debt, which is also a major prevailing issue out here. Um, okay, so let's look at this subject in a little bit in the context. We have a national debt which is now approaching $30 trillion. Now, historically, if we look back to the time period of let's say at the end of Bush's administration, that is W, and 2008, at the beginning of the economic crisis due to all the mortgage problems at the time, we had about $10 trillion of national debt. So, in other words, it's tripled in the subsequent 12 years. It's a very, and this I think plays into your inflation topic here a little bit. I'll try to connect them a little bit. The situation then becomes that what we have to look at is inflation, on the other hand, during that period was relatively low until this year. In other words, it was averaging somewhere a little bit above 2% for most of that time. There's some fluctuations. I think it hit 3 at one point, and so it went down to nearly 0 at some points, but I think it averaged around 2. So while you have a massive increase in the national debt, you have a fairly small amount of relative inflation during that period, which means the real national debt, if you want to look at it in those terms, was actually going up substantially during that period. Because by real, look at it this way, what you basically do is just pick a constant year dollar, pick a given year, and adjust for inflation to that year. Okay, so let's just use the current year, 2021. Okay, so if you adjust the debt to 2021, you'd probably get the 10 trillion would probably go down to, it would go up, excuse me, to maybe 12 or 12.5 adjusted to 2021 dollars. Okay, so you can see that going up to nearly 30, that's a tremendous increase in the real national debt. Okay, and so that plays into how you finance this whole subject, which is the government issues bonds and notes and T-bills and so forth. And if we look at the situation historically, the approach that was taken on this was to finance as much as possible with long-term debt. There are 30-year bonds and so forth, 20-year bonds, long-term debt. And so that when you have inflation, your debt load, what you usually do when you have inflation, that the Fed will arbitrarily increase the short-term rates, and they'll also decrease the money supply, and in that process, they will create a situation in which you slow down the economy and reduce inflation. Well, it's somewhat difficult to do that at the present time because going back to the 1990s, a guy named Bill Clinton got in there and looking at the debt problem, come up with a really interesting idea. He basically wanted to basically refinance, or continue to finance, let's put it this way, the national debt with shorter term notes rather than the long term bonds. And the shorter term notes, when inflation was low, which it was at the time, could be at fairly low interest rates. Okay, so that basically that reduced the annual deficit and hence the rate at which the debt was accumulating. In fact, he got a lot of credit for that. But what had actually happened was a refinancing from a prudent long-term financing technique, where you have to pay higher interest rates, but you have a degree of stability in your economy that way, to one where you have one that's a bit more precarious. Okay, so essentially, what you have in the current situation is that you will have roughly $30 trillion of debt. Okay, and the problem that you'll have with that is that that you will okay, let's say we decide to go from the near zero short-term rates we have now, under 1% or whatever, to fairly high short-term rates. Okay, let's say 4 or 5%. All right. What that would do is as the refinancing came in, the interest on the debt would skyrocket. And so like, for instance, a 30 trillion, a 1% increase on a 30 trillion of debt would be $300 billion. If it was 5%, it would be 1.5 trillion annually to finance this. Okay, until the rates went back down again. And so you would hit a very hard situation on the debt to be able to finance it. Remember, we were running $1 trillion a year national debt under the previous administration, and now Biden has just spent 1.9 trillion on this great so-called American Rescue Plan, and effectively what that's done is to cause a lot of inflation, I think, and I think most of the 6.8% inflation is in fact due to this excessive spending, and maybe some of it, and also just the basic recovery that you have a supply chain issue that occurred where demand for products had dropped off during the shutdowns, and all of a sudden the demand is up. Another thing you have to consider in this is that people have a lot more money now in some sectors of the economy, particularly, weirdly enough, it's the lower income sectors of the economy that actually have more money in their hands than they typically would have because of all the really high benefits that were put out under unemployment. The plussed up unemployment that existed through September nationally, and some states stopped it a little earlier, but it was it ended in September, was to add $15 an hour to whatever the normal rate of unemployment insurance would be, which, depending on the level of the job, would be relatively something like the minimum wage, basically, typically at the peak, and much lower than that for people in lower wage jobs. So, so you have somebody who was making minimum wage or something above minimum wage, all of a sudden they're now getting maybe up to $18, $20 an hour. At the same time, the economy was kind of shut down, and a lot of things they might have spent it on, they really can't because there's not, things are shut down. They're probably not going to go on a vacation, or they're not going to, a lot of things you might do, you wouldn't be able to spend money on during that period. So that now they have a lot of cash. And then we also have fear of the pandemic and whatever else. And so a lot of these people haven't returned to the workplace. And the other thing, of course, you have is that some of the elderly people, but nearing retirement age, probably people retired early. They were hit 62 and maybe they're going to work to 66 or 67, but decided to go ahead and take the unemployment at 62 because, well, they're out of work and they need money. And so, and all this kind of played into this situation. And I think right now we have, and also as a demographic change was going to hit anyhow, at the tail end of the baby boom, you're going to have a demographic impact. So what we have now is a very large number of jobs that are open and nobody to take them. Particularly the lower income areas are really hit hard at this moment. So at any rate, and of course that means people are having to move up wages in order to get the available people to compete for them. And so that also adds to an inflationary situation. So as shortage of goods and demand is up, shortage of labor and demand is up, is increasing inflation. And so we don't know how long this will last, but it is an ongoing issue that I think we're going to have to contend with. And the problem is the normal methods of fighting it, which is to basically increase the short-term interest rates and slow down the economy, is not really applicable. In fact, at the present time, we're still stimulating the economy. For instance, we still have the spending that's coming out of that big bill that was passed this last spring. All that money isn't spent yet. And they also have the fact that the Fed is creating money. And they are going into what they're calling a taper. But the taper is, how do we put it? The taper means that you're just not increasing the cash as much as you were before, but you're still doing it. Now, a way of looking at this issue of the taper is that we have the interesting thing about the Fed is, see, the Fed has an interesting situation. It'd be like if you had a bank account like they've got, where basically they just create money. I mean, in other words, they have the right to buy bonds, you know, from the Fed. I mean, from the Treasury, excuse me, from the Treasury, without actually having any money in the bank to do it. It'd be sort of like if you had a checking account with $10,000 in it, and you said, well, I wished I had 20,000, so I'll just log on my account here and type in 20,000 and replace the 10,000, hit return, and voila, I have $20,000. See, that's essentially what the Fed can do. It isn't literally printing it like printing the currency, you see. That's not what that really is. It's this. And that allows them to buy up these bonds that the government is issuing that nobody else wants to buy because the interest rates are so low. And so that's how the government is continuing to be able to spend all this money in spite of the fact that they don't have the revenue to support it. Anyway, it's an interesting situation we're facing. And so the real question comes down the road is, where do we go with this? Well, the debt is spiraling. Well, one solution the governments have done in the past, particularly in foreign governments, is to let inflation run. You see, if inflation were to run at a high rate, and let's say it would inflate to the point that the value of a current dollar would decline to what would be currently 50 cents, a factor of 2, then your $30 trillion debt would go down to $15 trillion. In constant dollars, assuming everything else inflates appropriately in terms of salaries and other factors of the economy, and hence the tax revenue would come in at that rate. So that's the kind of idea that we may be facing here with the with this higher inflation rate that we're getting. And there's no clear-cut idea of when it's going to stop. I mean, the Federal Reserve chairman they've been referring to it as transitory, but now he's saying he's not prepared to use that term anymore. So we don't know when it would stop, and it might just continue. Because one thing is, one aspect of inflation tends to feed the other aspect. In other words, as the cost goes up, then wages go up, then those wages, those costs are then passed on to the consumer, who are basically the same people who are getting the wages. So there's a feedback loop that starts to occur. And when you get this thing going, it's kind of hard to stop it. And it's sort of painful to stop it, as we experienced back many years ago for those who were around at that time. So at any rate, I decided to make this comments there. And by the way, if you like these videos, please subscribe and give me a like, because it helps out with the algorithm. And I have my links to my social media accounts are below in the descriptions. And we'll close this off for now.